Good evening. I'm Harold Hayes. This week marks the completion of the 90th year for the Metropolitan Opera. Exactly how happy a birthday party it will be is the subject for Roundtable tonight with Benita Eisler and three of her guests.
The Metropolitan Opera has been called the most expensive and glamorous cultural resource that our country possesses. The glamour is not in question, at least not this evening. The expense is. Recession has cut into income, hurting contributions and attendance. More opera buffs are staying home listening to old records, while inflation keeps pushing up costs. $27.5 million for the current season, and of these costs, 80% goes to labor. In February, management asked all employees to accept a 10% pay cut and a shorter work year, calling it a survival situation. Here to talk about the two elements most crucial to the Met's survival, labor and capital, are Anthony Bliss, board member of the opera for 26 years, and for 11 of those years, president of the board. Since November, executive director of the Metropolitan Opera. I, Philip Zipser, counsel for the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, as well as 39 other individual orchestras throughout the country. And for the Olympian View, Richard Kapp from the Olympus on 43rd Street, the Ford Foundation. I'd like to start by asking Anthony Bliss whether the request for a 10% pay cut wasn't a negotiating device analogous to Mayor Beam's this week in his budget slash, so that when contract time comes up at the beginning of August, there will be an understood wage freeze.
I wish it was, but we are up against survival. It's as simple as that. And I don't really like to think of this as a negotiation in the normal sense that I've been through it over the years. We really are faced at this point with a dialogue in which everybody connected with the opera has to come together and find the answers to very pressing problems which have arisen over recent years, not through the fault of any one side, but through the general economic and environment that we're living in today.
Well, I'd like to ask, because there's the famous quotation, by now famous in these lean times, of Mr. Louis Auchincloss, that the function of a trustee, there are three: money, money, and money. And the Met not only has its trustees or board, but also, as any reader of the evening program will note, a roster of names on the National Council and the Opera Guild. And with a $2 million deficit looming, it seems curious, why can't that very large group that represents probably our more prosperous music lovers fill that deficit?
But you've forgotten the item that very group has already contributed $7,200,000. The $2 million remaining deficit is on top of what is quite an extraordinary fundraising ability already demonstrated. Our problem is to increase that, which is exceedingly difficult to do under current conditions.
I'd like to ask Phil Zipser, in the depths of the Depression in 1932, Met employees were then asked to take a 10% pay cut, which they agreed to do. What is the difference in 75?
Well, I think I was 13 years old when that took place. So I couldn't really answer that question with any degree of reasonableness. I can't answer the question with respect to the problem now. And that is that whatever the motive was in 1932 with respect to artists, hospital workers, teachers in the schools, perfectly clear that in 1974 the concept of subsidizing institutions by the people who are employed by it is for another generation and another time. Today that concept is outworn and must be discarded, and the workers and artists and teachers and hospital workers should not be expected to subsidize the problems which are problems for the society as a whole. And for example, a 10% reduction in pay at a time when the cost of living rose some 12% in the last year would mean a reduction in take-home pay for 22% for the musicians. When you add to that the reduction in the number of weeks during the season, apparently there was a requested substantial reduction in the number of weeks, would mean that the take-home pay of the musicians would be reduced by 45%. That's an inconceivable burden on the employees of the Met, and one which I can assure, as we have assured Mr. Bliss, we will not agree to.
Isn't it also true, though, that the musicians in the orchestra, the opera orchestra and the symphony for that matter, do not live on their orchestra earnings, but all teach and indeed perform in concert?
I don't think that that's true. I think that there are some of the members of the orchestra who do teach and have other jobs, but fundamentally it is the income from the Metropolitan Opera that they are able to sustain their livelihood. And for those who have additional jobs and give of their time in other endeavors, I think that that really is not a relevant consideration. And that may be true for people in the broadcasting field who have other jobs, people who are lawyers who act in their spare time and make some additional money. And there are a great number of others who I suggest to you have additional income. The fact that their wives, some of their wives work, might be an added proposition. But under the circumstances, I would say that that's not an argument for a reduction in pay to these musicians.
In one of the most comprehensive books on problems of the performing arts, economists Baumol and Bowen, the performing arts, the economic dilemma, pinpoint the problem as one of handcrafts, that you cannot ask a violinist or a tenor to produce more to keep pace with the rising costs. And I'd like to ask Dick Kapp, because the Bowen and Baumol thesis from there, going on from there, is that it means that there must be inevitable and constant artificial respiration by government agencies and foundations. Is that something we can look forward to as something realistic?
Well, I don't know whether we can look forward to it. I think that the Baumol-Bowen report really put into print in a very forcible way something that, well, what you just referred to, which is the fact that, for instance, the violinist can't get through the opera by playing faster. He cannot take Götterdämmerung and manage to play it down faster. I know a couple of musicians who could, but they can't get away with taking a 5-hour piece and playing it in 3 hours and then doing it again. It's any more than you could speed up the tempo of a baseball game. Beyond a certain point, you can impose a 20-second time between pitches, but you can't force the pitcher to throw the ball 3 times at the same time. And they drove that point home very well. Now, what we have to look forward to, I don't really think we know. I think all we can say now is that we can look forward to the expense side of maintaining the institutions we have. We can start to say now, and I think the Ford Foundation's report, economic study of major performing arts institutions or organizations in the country has made the point very clearly that we can start with not accuracy, but we can at least point to directions on the expense side as to where the expenses are going to go. We can prognosticate about the income side, but the more we prognosticate, the worse the picture does appear to be, because the expenses as the cost of living rises, as demands rise, if only to keep pace, as productivity cannot inherently rise in the live performance, the expenses go up on one curve, sort of an exponential curve, and the sources of income are relatively finite, as they are for every aspect of the society. Ultimately, what we're going to have to be doing is making choices as to what is more important to us. What things do we want to preserve in a society that can't do everything? And it's a matter of priorities, and I think that's what the issue is going to come down to over the next decade.
Well, in terms of government support, where the city government is concerned, the bad news would seem to be, Tony Bliss, that the city budget allocations were halved in the last 2 years, coming down exactly by half of what they should be, out of a great deal more money, close to $4 million of a possible budget. What does that, as you look gloomily into a crystal ball, say about the desired objective of $2 million for the Met from the city?
It's not very encouraging, because we're going from nothing. We do get about $140,000 in the city towards the free concerts in the park, which unfortunately cost us $400,000. Though we're not being cut from anything that is substantial to begin with, and I hope that, like everybody else, that the fortunes of the city will eventually make it possible for them to do more for all of the arts in New York. But at the moment, I honestly do not look for help in that direction at this moment, though we're certainly going to take in fact, Phil and I sat together and talking with the city the other day and with other government officials in an effort to explore whether we could find additional public funds. It was not an encouraging meeting, I would say. But,
well, in your request regarding the cut in pay and work here, and in Mr. Zipps's remark about expecting the rank-and-file musicians and artists to underwrite, how does that work in terms of star contracts? What does a Nielsen or Sutherland, if she were able to perform this season, receive per performance?
Well, I don't think I can give you individual salaries of individual singers.
Well, it was $4,000 a performance under your Mr. Bing's reign, I have to just say.
It's substantial.
You don't think that should be public knowledge if you're asking for public support?
What each individual makes? I mean, not no more than I do that we should reveal each salary of every member of the orchestra. I mean, some of Mr. Zipps's clients do quite nicely, and others don't do quite as well, and I don't think that is proper for me to reveal at this point, certainly not without the authority and permission of the people involved. Frankly, I think we're going a little bit in the wrong direction. I don't think that either of us here should be engaging in negotiations on this show. I think that it's very important that we get to the problems that exist and the total financial picture of the arts.
Well, let me ask you.
I cannot engage in any debate as to whether or not the musicians are overpaid or the singers are overpaid or whatnot, because
well, getting into other problems of expenditures, which is the question of the house, which it has been suggested by others than myself that it is an auditorium that is, first of all, being once again, half again as large as the largest European opera auditorium, maybe strangling the tenant. Would there be any possibility in terms of saving money to look into a smaller opera house?
Your basic costs of the company are going to be the same in a small opera house or a big opera house.
Would you be earning more money, though, in a smaller one?
No, because your seating capacity is much smaller in a smaller house. Your revenue is cut down every night that we perform in the Metropolitan Opera. If we do have a sellout, it's close to $59,000 of income. And if the house was half as large, we'd be getting in about $30,000 of income, and the expenses are not of the house are not that much more than a house of a smaller size to make up.
But what about the nights when attendance is 60 to 70%?
It's rarely down to that. We average 85. We hope to average about 85 to 86% before this end of this week is over. I think it's about 85.3 or 4 right now, which is actually a very healthy attendance by many of the smaller houses. There are a lot of houses in Europe that are a lot smaller than Metropolitan, whose average attendance is not as high as that, or certainly not much higher. On the other hand, we have known higher attendance at the Metropolitan, and I hope we will know higher attendance again next year.
I'd like to make a comment in connection with a question which you asked, and I don't think that the size of the house, despite the New York Times review of that situation, the European houses, is really dispositive of the question. For example, in the article in the New York Times, they indicated that some of the European governments subsidized the opera house to the tune of as much as $22 million, and the prices of the tickets range from $15 to $25, which in a sense is even higher than some of the prices charged by the Met. It seems to me that one has to take a good look at the report, a magnificent report made by the Ford Foundation. And that report demonstrates that even if the Met sold out every single night, and that's true for every symphony orchestra in the country, there would be a huge deficit. For example, in 1970-71, the deficit gap was some $68 million. That is the gap between income from tickets and other proceedings at the opera house or the symphony orchestra, or the theater, whichever art form was involved. And yet there is this tremendous gap of $68 million, which was the gap in 70-71, according to the Ford Foundation. And that gap will rise at a 7% inflation level to $330 million, 5 times the amount. Query, where is that money going to come from? Can it come from the sources that we expected it to come from before? For example, in 1970-71, $8 million was granted from all governmental sources, state, municipal, and federal sources. It is estimated that 10 years from now, 10 years from that time, meaning 1980-81, it will require a massive infusion of government money to keep the arts in the picture. Now, it seems to me that realistically, our listeners ought to know that it is impossible to keep the current level of artistic excellence in this country without huge infusions of government money. This is assuming that the foundations will give us what they gave before. This is assuming that individual donors will give what they gave before. And we know now that in 1975, the contributions by the foundations and individual donors, while they were an all-time high last year to the Met, I think some $7 million, is simply not enough. So I think the point made by Mr. Kapp, that you can't get more production out of the artist, is the critical aspect of this problem, and that the listeners ought to know that no matter how many times a house is sold out, an opera house or a symphony house is sold out, there will be a tremendous gap, a deficit gap, between income from the sales of tickets and the needs of the house. And this will, of course, continue to 1980.
There are a couple of things I want to pick up on there. One is very technical, which is the projections, Phil, that you cite there are alternate projections, and you're citing one that looks particularly drastic. And in any event, what we say is if X and Y and Z do occur, then A, B, and C might follow. But the general picture goes in the direction you point. We are not pointing to any 332 million deficit by a certain date as anything certain. It is if one set of factors occurs, it could be that bad. It could be a little better. It could be a little worse. It's not going to be good. And I must say, you know, let me take advantage of our Olympian position. I think that the underlying issue here is not only economic, but basically it's totally philosophical. The fact is, one must love something before one supports it, ultimately, volitionally. It's one thing, we have the Department of Defense, which Austria doesn't have. So Austria can put money in the Wiener Staatsoper because they just don't have an Austrian army that has the commitments that the United States Armed Forces do have.
I'm willing to settle on that subject. I'm willing to reduce our military expenditures by 75%.
It should be that we should seek subsidy for the arts in this country through the Department of Defense. There is a possibility.
Now, I think that's a great suggestion. Great suggestion.
Of the Department of Psychic Defense. But the real issue, it seems to me, is philosophical. It isn't a matter of supporting our institutions. It's a matter of affirming or reaffirming which of them are really deeply important to us and why. And they have to be important to us for human reasons, for reasons of beauty, for simply because we love certain things. We must be able to say, I love this. And if we don't love it, ultimately we will let it go. We won't find a way to save it. We have to be willing to fight for something, and the only way we will fight for it is if we love it. And I think this has historically been true of the arts. I think the tragedies occur when the arts become the commodity that in the sense that we're talking about them now, at the point where it's one more commodity, sooner or later it becomes insufferable. Whether it's an educational system, whether it's a defense department, whether it's the arts, it becomes insufferable because you don't want it, but you have to have it. And you finally say, I don't want it. And it's gone. But we can't...
Is that what's happening to the Met, though?
That's the good question.
Very well
that's the good question.
Could very well happen.
Because a remark made to me by a former official of the New York State Council last year was a very tough one, in which he said the Met is a 19th century Leviathan, and the real question is who needs it and who wants it?
Well,
who does? And do they want it enough, as Dick said, to pay for it?
Benita, you could argue that there's been a change in our tastes since the closing of the immigration laws. That the constant influx of new people who brought, for better or worse, either a culture that was already theirs or one they aspired to in their homelands but couldn't afford, gave them impetus to do things here. And with the closing of those laws, you finally reach a third generation, which is an American indigenous generation, which is making very strong assertions about what it wants and believes in. You could argue that. The fact is that in the Western world, there still remains, for one reason or another, if you were at the Siege of Corinth and I was not, that was a very real reaction to that production and to that performance. I saw reviews in the New York press that found it laughable, but the fact is that Magda Olivero, for 30 years, can make not only strange people cry. It's an incredible experience. This is part of the culture of a great many of us. And I think that it's still properly done, beautifully executed, still speaks to us in a way that nothing else can, in the way that the Greek myths speak to us. In many ways, I think the real problem is where is, aesthetically, our new output in this genre. We have new ballet, we have new theater, we accept our new output in every other genre, and yet we have difficulty accepting our new, self-renewing operatic output. I think these are ultimately philosophical questions.
I am not sure that that's correct, because I know that the opera in the parks attracted hundreds of thousands of people.
Good point.
The question really is access to the arts. There was a report which was really a survey of the attitudes of people to the arts. I think ACA made the report. And they came up with a conclusion that people making $5,000 or less were willing to have $5 a year checked off on their tax forms like we check off $1 for the electoral purposes.
It was a Harris survey.
What was it?
I think it was a Harris.
Yes, that was the Harris survey, and it showed that people with $5,000, that's $100 a week, were willing to do that, and people making more were willing to check off $25, and there were people who were making $15,000 or $20,000 willing to check off $50, which means there is a real desire. The real question is, how do you bring the arts to the people? And that, I think, is where we have been very, very deficient. And when I say we, I'm talking about management, I'm talking about the union, I'm talking about the artists themselves. And if we're going to ask for federal funding and city funding and state funding, we're going to have to go to the communities. And we're going to have to bring arts to the communities. And I am sure that once we do that, we're going to have the kind of support which we need. I remember as a young lad standing in front of my fruit stand Saturday afternoon listening intently to the Met Opera, and I would judge that tens of millions of Americans over the course of the last 40 or 50 years have had the same experience that I had. And therefore, the question of values, a value system, I think is evidenced by the Harris survey, by the fact that the radio program is still one of the most popular programs on the air.
That did bring it to the people, though, Phil. I mean,
of course.
And the increase in local companies all over the United States now.
And it seems to me that this is such a critical question, that how do we bring the arts to the people? And is not the opera and the ballet and the symphony orchestra matters which raise the level of our people and which bring to them a balm so necessary in this time? And one of the questions which I think has to be posed time and time again, and people say, well, we need money for this and we need money for that, and the arts are on the lower rung. And I think we have to change that attitude among very, very substantial numbers of people. And incidentally, Congressman Fred Richmond of Brooklyn is about to introduce a bill which would propose a checkoff of monies by people that could check it off on their tax returns. And I think that whether this bill passes or not, it is an indication that Congress is seriously entertaining the problem of how do we finance the arts. And that is, and incidentally, we have to thank you for this program, because I think this is one of the ways in
I'm
which we
delighted to be
can,
here.
in which we can bring to the public that it can't be the artist alone who is going to subsidize the arts any more than the hospital worker or anybody else is going to subsidize a hospital. It's got to be the responsibility of the 200 million people in the United States to subsidize the arts and its government and its various levels of government. And I think $8 million, which was the amount in 1970 or 71, is a very paltry sum. It's an insignificant amount of money, and there's got to be some recognition, and we've got to talk about $150 million, $200 million into the field of arts so that we can bring it realistically to the people of this country.
But the real question will be, of course, where the Met and Opera itself is concerned, whether, as Dick had started to suggest, it has become by now, in some sense, an indigenous enough form for it to survive. I mean, the curious thing in its transplanting is that it became in this country a very aristocratic, or so thought of by most people. I mean, if you go on any evening, what is occupying the peanut gallery, where in Naples or elsewhere in Europe you would see working class people are students who will doubtless be poor musicians one of these days. But it is not a heterogeneous class experience at this point, certainly.
I don't agree with you. If you go to the city opera, where the prices are lower, and you go to many opera companies all over the country, I think there's an enormous interest and support for opera and for all of the arts today, a rapidly increasing interest.
I think that there is a real problem, and there was a New York Times article about the elitism of the board of the Metropolitan Opera, and that ought to be discussed. There are, for example, and I hate to say this because I'm a lawyer, but there are 13 lawyers on the board of 51 people. We ought to reduce that number and have some
all three of you are lawyers.
All three of us
right.
are lawyers. And that we ought to, for example, have a more representative group of people on the board of directors of the Met.
On that
I think
democratic
that's terribly
note,
important.
the curtain is ringing down on us, so I'd like to thank Dick Kapp, Philip Zipser, Anthony Bliss for joining us.
Thank you, Benita. That's it for tonight. On Monday, the mayors of New York, Newark, and Jersey City tell us how they're trying to solve the financial fiasco facing the metropolitan area. I'm Harold Hayes. Have a good weekend.